When I tell you that my pronouns are she, they, what does that mean to you? What does it mean for me to say that I am a woman? Does it mean that I'm strong? Does it mean that I'm smart? Does it mean that I'm someone who's gentle? Does it mean I'm someone who enjoys cooking? If it does mean any of those things, does it mean that being a man is necessarily not those things? If being a woman means that I'm smart, does it mean that being a man is not? Gender is necessarily a dichotomy. It is necessarily something that is going to be a combination of characteristics, which when we choose to apply that label to ourselves, we are saying that these are characteristics that I identify with. These are ones that I choose to define how I view myself and how I want the world to interact with me. What we're going to tell you that when we recognize that identity is something that is fluid and dynamic and that can evolve over time, we tell you that gender is something that has become not only has become irrelevant, but trying to hold on to it is something that has become harmful. What we believe when we say that this house prefers a world with no gender, we believe that this means that we as a society should push towards the slow dissolution of the concept of gender. We believe that this would happen after the period that we're currently in as society, where recognition of gender is something that is incredibly important, where things like gender-based violence still affect women. Well, we have the gender-based component of gender-based violence, where women are therefore viewed as inferior to men in many circumstances. We understand that in this current situation, it is important to prioritize gender in certain situations, particularly in policy, to solidify that boundary between men and women, because the situation is so different, and also non-binary individuals, because the situation is different, and as a result, women have different needs. We believe that this motion takes place after that situation, when gender-based violence is no longer has gender as its basis. This might be in 100 years' time, this might be in 1,000 years' time, this might be in a parallel universe. What we are saying is that this is something that we would push to a point where the claim would be meaningless. What is our understanding of the term gender? Gender is something that is always a dichotomy, whether it is two genders that are currently recognized in society, or perhaps 3 or 5. The point is that it's always a dichotomy or a choice that an individual makes. So the way in which gender manifests is through two mechanisms. Firstly, it's the choice of an individual with how they choose to express themselves and how they personally identify in terms of a gender. But secondly, we think it's important to acknowledge that gender is also how a society receives you and how a society interacts with you. Because you can't exist as a gender outside of society. The way it interacts with you will always be an important component of your gender. Yeah.
You can't defend the world in 100 years' time. There'll always be remnants of the current world then.
Yeah, you will always have the remnants of the current world. The remnants of the current world which ascribe value to gender is the sort of remnants that we're hoping to move away from. And we'll explain that to you throughout our case. Okay, so what we think is very important in today's debate is that we definitely need an opposition that commits to the understanding of gender as categories that necessarily hold a semblance of truth and validity behind them. We think that that is necessary for their case. They cannot come up here and say gender holds no meaning and is something that people can fluidly choose between the two. To do that would be to side with our side of the house. We think that that would be a transition process towards our policy, says Giuseppe. Okay, so we think there are two possible ways in which the dissolution, the way our case will work out is I'm going to be talking to you about why gender is irrelevant because of the ways in which gender can be enacted and the ways in which gender can be interacted with will always be harmful. And this is for two reasons. Firstly, because the value is found in gender through this concept of shared experience, but secondly, through why gender will always be a limitation on your ability to express yourself. Okay, so one of the main reasons that people find value in gender is because of this idea of a value that is found in identity. So the idea that you have a shared experience with other women, with other men, with other gender non-binary individuals. You are able to relate to other women in certain ways and that you're able to have solidarity with them. Okay, two responses to this. Firstly, we don't think that this is inherent to gender. We think that you're able to have solidarity outside of this relatively random thing. We don't lose the ability to have identity and solidarity in other spaces. But secondly, we think that this is always going to be a sort of false solidarity. It's going to be the idea that everyone has a gender, which is necessarily under this model, means that it's always going to be such a large group that you now have to feel solidarity to. So big that it's never going to be possible, right? In the same way that we think that Hillary Clinton can claim to represent a woman by virtue of identifying as a woman is incredibly false, because the interests that she pushes and the things that she pushes in government don't represent the interests of all women. Her appeal to womanhood is one that was incredibly disingenuous, one that was felt to be false for a lot of women, because what it meant to be a woman was different for all those people. We find it incredibly hard to have a coherent narrative of womanhood because the group is just so incredibly large. But the other possible way in which, and the only way in which I personally find a relationship with womanhood, is one that's defined through this shared experience of suffering and discrimination, which we think is something that is inherently very problematic. So I feel very confident identifying as a woman when the issue of gender-based violence comes across, because this is an issue that affects me because of my womanhood, because of my gender identity, because of how society receives me. However, if that solidarity that I feel with other women in that moment is because of suffering, that means in order for gender to be held as a valid ideal or as a valid principle in society, we need to preserve the patriarchy, right? And we think that that is a harmful idea. The idea that femininity and womanhood needs to be defined through suffering and shared experiences of pain is something that is a very harmful ideal to perpetuate. Even if we didn't have to perpetuate the patriarchy, we would still have to find something else that was common amongst all women. Incredibly hard if not suffering. But if we are able to find something other than patriarchy, that is still harmful because of how it limits expression. My second point. So you need enough within a gender identity to have content to it in order for it to be meaningful in the first place. So it needs to have characteristics. If that characteristic is not suffering, as I mentioned before, it is still going to be something that is prescriptive. That means in having a gender identity, whether it is the one that you were bestowed upon at birth or one that you chose for itself, you're unable to redefine the characteristics of it without alienating yourself from that gender. That either means that you're restricted in terms of how you choose to present yourself relative to those characteristics, or it means that you might end up in a situation where you feel you have to meet certain things in order to prove that you are a woman. If, for example, I'll use Harry Potter houses if we want to use an example for more clarity. Whilst you may have a Ravenclaw and a Gryffindor, if you're clever and therefore are a Ravenclaw, you have to prove that you're brave but still a Ravenclaw. You have to prove that you're cleverer than you are brave to prove I really am a Ravenclaw. We think that if you have a system of characteristics that determine what category you belong into, you're always going to have to prove that you meet the characteristics for the identity group that you've chosen in order to feel valid in it, in order to access any benefit from it, whether it's in solidarity with others or whether it's just an expression. I'm proud to stand on government bench.
To think that I can understand my own gender identity as a non-binary, gender-fluid individual as I am is to fundamentally ignore the fact that to navigate that terrain, I need some sort of indicators, some sort of markers that allow me to come to terms with who I am on a gendered front to begin with. The point at which Micaella thinks that gender, firstly, in this debate can only be spoken about on gendered terms, but secondly, that gender requires suffering, is firstly a fundamental misunderstanding of what gender looks like and means to a person, but secondly, also ignores the fundamental middle ground of the poles of the gender spectrum. We need to understand things like gender and sexuality on a spectrum to begin with in order to navigate that spectrum in the first place. What are the core premises that we're going to be asserting and explaining to you today? Firstly, we're going to be talking to you explicitly as to why we don't need to defend the harms of the subscription to binary gender identities to begin with. We don't need to protect the patriarchy. That's not our burden. I'll explain why. But secondly, in terms of our core premise here, we're going to be explaining to you why specifically understanding nuances on a gendered front, understanding yourself and who you can relate to on a gendered front, requires some degree of understanding the indicators that make up your identity to begin with. What their burden looks like, given the shallow, very flippant analysis we get from this PM speech, is that they need to then inherently defend one gender performance to begin with. Because an important thing that they just don't want to talk about is the fact that gender is performativity, right? What that means is that firstly, gender is a socialized thing, we can acknowledge that, but also secondly, gender is a preference-based thing that you navigate and constantly mold yourself, right? The point at which we ignore the idea that gender can fluctuate and be one thing or many things at the same time is the point at which we think people ought to subscribe to one gender performance in the first place. If you want to prefer a world in which gender doesn't exist, you prefer one homogeneous performance on a gender gendered identity front to begin with. I'll explain why it's not for shame. So let's get into some much needed rebuttal. On a principle front, Micaella's undermined the opening government already. Why? Firstly, they try to assert to you that gender in and of itself is a dichotomy, with never really interrogating that notion to begin with. So let's interrogate it right now. What does gender mean, and why is their understanding of it inherently harmful? They firstly think that gender specifically requires suffering. We think that's incredibly harmful, firstly, because at no point is being a woman being a victim. At no point is being a woman being a sufferer of the patriarchy. That, it sure, is a symptom of the harms of a patriarchy to begin with. But understanding yourself as a woman can be separated and disentangled from the patriarchy too. Why do we know that that's true? Firstly, because women don't just exist on biological terms, right? We understand that gender and sex are different things. But secondly, we understand that trans identities matter. For a trans human being to identify as a woman is so important in understanding why gender is intrinsically unlinked and uncoupled from sex to begin with. Based on their very binary analysis, which I'm shocked by, they seem to only understand women through one lens, firstly, but secondly don't understand that people can possess multiple genders at once. You can be a woman, but you can be multiple things at once too on a gendered front, or not, right? That's the first thing. But secondly, they think that they want to talk to us about how expression is limited without interrogating that either. So let's delve into that. What does expression look like when it's most valuable to the individual? And this is the core premise that we assert to you today. When we talk about gender, we do understand that there are harms in prescribing poles to gender, right? So to understand the stereotypical man versus the stereotypical woman are the two poles of a gender spectrum. Fine, we're going to concede that to understand anything stereotypically can be harmful. But why are we not forcing that binary on people on our side either? Because we're saying even if you have poles to a spectrum, we think as well most people fall somewhere in between that. We don't want to advocate for understanding gender as one homogeneous binary thing, but we also think it's important to understand that it exists on some kind of scale, right? I'll take you in a second. If we're going to understand gender, having some degree of poles to that spectrum allow you to navigate that spectrum in the first place. Much like sexuality. If we're going to talk about sexuality existing on a spectrum, then we have to understand that compartmentalizing somewhat loosely allows you to ascribe certain characteristics to that allow you to feel secure within your own identity to begin with. Sure.
If you can identify anywhere along that spectrum, and you can be a combination of anything that you choose, where's the value that you derive from that identity, from that gendered identity, rather than choosing your identity on something else, expressing independent of gender?
Okay, sure. So firstly, panel, they seem to think that they can have gender fluidity on their side. They can't. To have gender fluidity, for me to identify as gender fluid, which I do, means I understand that I exist somewhere on a gendered spectrum, right? Which means I've navigated my own gender on a spectrum. In a world that doesn't have gender or prefers no gender, the spectrum firstly doesn't exist, but secondly, concepts like gender fluidity don't exist. We would never advocate for a world that doesn't allow for people to do things like identify as gender fluid. But secondly, let's talk about what characteristics allow you to ascribe a label to your gender, or an understanding, it doesn't have to be a label, to your gender. This is the kind of analysis we need if we're going to talk about shared experiences and relating to people in a meaningful way. That looks like many things. In the same way that we would approach music from a genre perspective. It doesn't mean that genres then become so compartmentalized to the point that we understand music to be completely separate compartmentalized things. We think certain crossovers and bleeding in between certain genres of music, for instance, is very analogous to what we mean when we talk about gender. Why is that the case? Because gender, if we talk about femininity and masculinity and everything in between that, means that you relate to people in terms of how they perceive and approach the world. What that means is that someone not just who likes the same things as you or dresses the same as you, but someone who understands their femininity or their masculinity or anything on a gendered front in a similar way to you allows you to understand behavioral similarities between you. We think the core component of gender is the performance of gender, right? And performance is behavioral. If you can identify with someone on a behavioral front, that means you can understand some sort of labeled or compartmentalized identity on that front. Why is that valuable? If you engage with the world never on a gendered front, you never allow for an understanding of what you share with other people. You only approach the world in a way that means everyone is different to everyone, and I'm never going to find someone I can share experiences and behavior with. That's particularly harmful when we use something like intersectional analysis, right? If you are a woman despite any intersectional analysis as to what it means to be a specific type of woman or kind of woman, then you just approach womanhood as one homogeneous thing. That's what happens when we remove gender from like our understanding of the social construct. But finally, we think gender is an incredibly valuable heuristic tool, right? If we're going to problem solve and understand our place in the world, gender allows us to navigate that. So even if gender doesn't allow for some sort of self-navigation internally, you can at least navigate the world you're in a very healthy and valuable way. If we're going to talk about people understanding what it means to understand themselves and the world around them, if we're going to value things like trans identities and gender fluidity, you need a spectrum, you need to stand for opposition.
I'd like to call on the guest leader of opposition.
Human beings have an intrinsic, inherent need to navigate the world in a way that they can understand it. Semantics matter, language matters, not because it is fixed, not because it cannot be changed, not only because of the connotations that certain people have in it, but the way that I can use language, the way that I can describe myself in a way that firstly makes me able to understand myself, but also signals to other people certain characteristics that I want them to know about me, so that people with those same characteristics, people with that same lived experience, which we do value, can understand that the signals that I'm giving off via language, via labels, if that's the way that they want it to seem, is one that invites people with the same experience that I do. If tomorrow I decide to use a different label because I want to signal to people with that label that I'd like to share that experience with them, we think that's fine. We think what OG brings to us is the idea that we have to defend gender as it currently is. We think, especially when they place all their analogies in the cis experience of what a biological female understands womanhood to be, firstly is dangerous. Secondly, forces us to defend the status quo, which is not what we have to do in this debate. We don't have to defend the current common conception of gender. We don't have to tell you that these labels are as strict as they want them to seem. Secondly, we don't have to defend the conservative, very limited, fixed definitional terms of gender. We think that the value in language is that it can shift, but that the value that you have in explaining yourself and coming to terms with your personhood means that you navigate the world in a way that is less emotionally burdensome, but also allows you to self-actualize more. What does a world look like that doesn't understand gender? We lose out on the inherent shiftiness that is identity. We lose out on the fluidity thereof. That is why this motion is specifically important for people who don't identify in the way with their sex. As long as we have a world that has difficulty conceptualizing the difference between sex and gender, we need to have gender as a construct so that we can identify beyond our sex. So, we think that this relates to the squirreled nature of the motion that they've given us, the idea that we can eventually separate gender from oppression, that we can somehow in the future reach a world in which gender doesn't matter. Firstly, if that is true, if we can remove negative connotations from gender, if there exists a world in which women are no longer oppressed based on the characteristics that the world has placed upon them, then we can also negate all the harms that they mention. Then we can also negate all the social connotations, the value-laden connotations that come with, say, perhaps womanhood. If we can exist in a world that doesn't have gender-based violence, then we can also negate the harms that they bring of categorization, because the harms of categorization are not intrinsic. It is not that categories limit you, rather it is that often other people place you in categories that you don't want to be in. If we can separate ourselves from a world that is patriarchal, if we can separate ourselves from a world that sees wearing a skirt as inherently a sign of weakness, then we also think that we can wear skirts and not have that mean anything beyond the fact that it is an expression of who we are. We also think that they misunderstand the intersectionality and the multiple facet nature of identity. The fact that gender exists doesn't mean that all women just come together and sing Kumbaya. We think that in a world that is moving towards intersectionality, we think in a world that we don't limit your entire identity to gender, means that they can't stand up and tell us we should find alternative ways of identifying ourselves. Note that still lies and is still premised on the value of compartmentalization. Because if you say that we should identify in other ways, then you say that we still need heuristic tools to identify themselves. As long as that is valuable, we might as well add gender to that, to the way in which it gives richness to our experiences and allows us to express ourselves in unique ways. Sure.
Corlia, I identify as a woman. Please tell me one characteristic that you infer from that signal about me.
This comes into my analysis on shared experience. The moment they talk about connotation and then talk about shared experience implies that you can separate the one from the other. So we don't necessarily have to say that there have to be negative connotations as women, but also that POI lies in the status quo and the idea that you have to advocate for problematic definitions when it comes to womanhood. You don't have to. In the future we can change that. But let's deal with Micaella's analysis as to why it's inherently problematic to share identities with people based on shared experience. Firstly, we tell you that's wrong, but also we tell you that their misunderstanding of intersectionality means that the experience that they advocate for isn't as homogenous as they want it to seem. But more importantly, we think that signaling to other people based on shared experience is inherently valuable. In the same way that signaling to people that you like a certain genre of music means that you can have better discussions, means that you can have discussions with people who you share these things with, that adds an important and intrinsically valuable aspect of the human experience that we not want to deny from everyone. So if we can see that in the status quo, gender is based inherently in performance, we think that taking that label away also takes away the inherent link this performance has to your identity. So when wearing a skirt, for example, is just wearing a skirt, it means that it negates the ability for this symbolism to mean something for who you are as a person. We think that that means that people are forced into a world that is relatively boring, relatively homogenous, and ways that they are forced to search for more taxing, more emotionally burdensome ways to describe themselves. But also let's look at what Kate brings us, that any type of categorization is wrong, and that any type of labeling is wrong. When you refer to a table as a table because it looks like this, it doesn't negate your ability to refer to anything as a table as long as you think that it works as a table. We think that the idea that categorization is inherently wrong, and that's what you base your premise of your debate is wrong, because categorization is not as bad as they make it seem. Secondly, it doesn't have to exist in the way that it makes it seem, but also we think that categorization is an important linguistic tool for yourself because it allows you to navigate the world around you in a way that is valuable, but also easy, because we do value the idea that even if performance is certainly problematic, we do think that it circumnavigates a lot more emotionally taxing ways in which you need to explore your identity. We think it's analogous to sexuality, right? In that if we don't have labels for sexuality, even though we can hop around between them, even though we can define them to an extent for ourselves, we think that it's a lot more difficult to say, I like this, 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 and this, but I don't like that. We think that the linguistic tool of being able to describe your experience in one that makes sense, but to also make sense to other people, means that the human experience is one that is more shared, and one that is more shared meaningful.
Mr. Speaker, Virginia Woolf said that if we want women to develop on their own, we need to give them their own room. Boso said, fuck the room, we'll give them cities. We're going to go a step further and tell you that even the cities themselves are defunct. What you are getting an extension, therefore, is that it is inherently the categorization of gender that is the very basis of all forms of oppression through the attribution of an agglomeration of arbitrary characteristics to people. So, in context, how do we think that we frame this debate in terms of women's emancipation? Firstly, to notice the way in which the waves of feminism have evolved. So the move from first wave to second wave feminism saw a move from seeking legal equality to seeking substantive equality. Third wave feminism seeks to address the failures that have arisen thereof. But notice that despite all of the great gains that all three of these waves have made, that we still have a huge amount of oppression. We posit that the very categorization of gender is the very factor that structurally limits the move towards women's emancipation, and that as long as gender exists, it can never occur. Why do we think that this is the case? The first thing to notice is that when you seek to become less oppressed through mitigating the extent to which gender plays a primary role in your life, the logical prior is that your gender that you were assigned was oppressive. What do we mean by this? We mean that the reason that it's empowering for people to start identifying as non-binary is because the gender that they were assigned by society, the fact that they were given a truck or a doll at birth, is the very thing that was oppressive. That is to say that they only had to change the way in which they identify because what was originally given to them was wrong. The extent to which we don't originally give them that thing, there is no longer a reason to identify as something else. So the arguments that Giuseppe gives you relate to the fact that gender currently dominates our lives. It is only the fact that we have such a view of gender as the very primary factor that defines the way that we engage in society that is the thing that oppresses us. The extent to which gender no longer exists, we no longer need to be empowered by limiting the role that it plays in society. Secondly, though, notice that the attribution of gender is always logically unjust. What do we mean by this? The fact that gender is extrapolated from sex. That is to say that you obviously cannot choose if you are born with a penis or vagina, but then that society attributes characteristics as a result of that fact. As Giuseppe says, the things that are assigned to you influence the behaviors that you then express in society. No matter how you feel, and no matter how you change your actions later in life, notice the primacy of development on the way that you live your life. That is to say that no matter how you feel, no matter how much you strongly identify as another thing, the very fact that society originally conditioned you to act in the binaries of either male or female is the thing that means that you are still going to act in those particular behaviors. Because you have never chosen your sex, you have never chosen part of your gender performance, therefore, that is always going to be unjust. So, what do we think that realistically happens in the comparative when we see, as we agree with the opening, a metaphysical conception of gender no longer existing? We think that realistically, because gender is extrapolated from sex, what it means in this hypothetical world, when gender no longer exists, is that we cannot discriminate based on these attributed characteristics. That is to say that we can't discriminate against women because we perceive that the fact that they have ovaries now means that they are meek, that they are feeble, that they are less confident, etc., etc. Notice the key thing here, though, is that women are oppressed in two ways. They are oppressed in terms of gender and they are oppressed in terms of sex. Obviously, those are recursive, though. The key thing to notice is that those are two differences that society ascribes to them. Discrimination always works on the basis of exaggerating a difference and attaching further things to it. That means that the extent to which we eliminate one of those differences means that there is now less oppression in society. This is fundamentally a mathematical argument, therefore. The reason that this works is that when you have gender characteristics ascribed to your sex, what that means is you have personality characteristics ascribed to your physical characteristics. The reason that this becomes so pervasive is that your personality characteristics, for example, how confident you are, how competent you are, how intelligent you are, these things affect you in all spheres of life. Because of the analysis I already gave you, that you can never opt out of those things, what that means is that when we perceive gender, we therefore oppress women in all spheres of life due to the existence of their gender role. That is not true when the only difference is sex, because we cannot then say that the very fact that a woman has an ovary means that she's going to be less competent in the role of managing a company. That never happens. This is why we are going to be inherently better for women. No, Corlia, you had your chance. Okay, so why do we think that this is always going to be the case? What we have to understand here is the way in which society treats things that have been oppressive and how we engage with them to make them less oppressive. What do we mean by this? In the case of the economics of care, so when we say things like roles that are traditionally associated to women are treated less in society. So, for example, things in the care industry working in those sorts of things being paid less than men, and things like being in motherhood being assigned less society signaling value than things like being a father. The crucial thing to note is that there are two ways that we make these things less oppressive. The first way is to say that something like raising a child is not only women, it is men too, and men can also raise children. Notice that what we do when we say that is that we eliminate the extent to which gender is primary. That is to say that we eliminate one of the characteristics we have just attached to gender. That amounts to the principle of removing gender from the way that we treat society. The second way that we make those things less oppressive is to say we acknowledge the value of things that have traditionally been viewed as female. So, for example, care is traditionally viewed as female, but we think that kind of care is extremely valuable. When we do that, there are two problems. Firstly, the problem is that we then limit women in what they are allowed to do. So even if we say that we value women when they act in the care industry, we're still limiting them to the care industry. That's still oppressive in ways. But secondly, the other way that this works is to say, well, women do other things too. So women aren't just mothers, they are also breadwinners. They also work in big business. The problem then is, again, that we are taking away the extent to which gender is defining the role that a woman plays. What that amounts to is reducing the extent to which we are defining gender, i.e. amounting to eliminating the extent to which gender operates. What's quite clear is the arguments that Giuseppe and Corlia give you tell you about a world in which gender exists and how we deal with it. They don't engage with the fact that we are preferring a world in which gender never existed in the first place. For these reasons, I have never been prouder to propose.
Mr. Speaker, Marsha P. Johnson was a trans woman who threw the first brick at the police during the Stonewall riots. From her immense bravery came the liberation of gay people in the United States, but also a massive global movement to which most people could associate themselves. Shaniae and I are going to be a little bit counterintuitive. We're going to tell you that gender is the only reason why we can keep certain oppressed groups safe and allow them to access safe spaces. What will we be talking about in terms of an extension? Firstly, why do harmful things like gender-based violence, gendered sex, and discrimination in the workplace exist in the first place? And I need to take you back a little bit, so bear with me. Richard Attenborough spent about 3 months in the jungles of Cambodia observing orangutans. And he found that evolutionary people were always going to exert their dominance over others with physical means, right? The way in which I look. I'm going to choose for example, my partners that I want to mate with how beautiful they are, how attractive they are towards me. They also socialized in different ways because of this physical attribute that they had. I think when you remove gender, you don't remove the physical attribute that biological males have. Right? You don't remove their ability to still assert their dominance in a very physical way over other individuals. A world without gender is simply a world without the construct, but it is not a world without the ability to assert dominance through physical means and through intellectual means. So we think you change nothing under your side of the house. What do we think the comparative looks like in today's debate? I think you have to notice that human beings are very quick to capitalize on their advantages. Even if you were to talk about like a world without race, we still think individuals would discriminate against people in Africa. Let's say like everyone in the world was black or white, for example. People will still use justifications like being able to discriminate on people's cultures or languages, for example. The other vulnerabilities, the fact that they don't have the financial capability to fund massive military operations. The fact that, for example, they don't have a religion that is comparable to mine. Even if you remove those barriers, those constructs that we have created for ourselves, people will discriminate in other ways that are as harmful in the status quo. So what is the problem here? I think that the current constructs aren't necessarily as negative and harmful as they say under their side of the house. All we need to do with those constructs is maintain them and change the way in which people use them to associate with themselves and to affect change in the real world. And this is where the main part of the extension comes in, now that I've explained why nothing really changes under their side of the house. And I need to mention some other names past Marsha Johnson. People like Victoria Cruz, people like Sylvia Rivera, people like Miss Macy Griffin Major. And I think these individuals were very fundamental in the change of society as a whole. But you know where they started out as? They started out as underground movements. They had meetings in people's houses. They had no funding whatsoever. And I think the comparative that I'm trying to make here is it would be beyond their wildest dreams to see in the current world that we have ever-growing legal punishment for gender-based violence, for example. People who sexually assault women and children, for example, in the United States, get life without the option of parole. People who, for example, like the Nicholas Ninau, who sexually assaulted the girl, went, I think, 4 life terms for what he did to her. Yes, it is not a perfect world, but it is a world in which there is change that is happening incrementally. You're not going to affect that change within a day, within a year, or within a decade. These changes are happening. We think civil society has also become more active in trying to address these changes, trying to incubate people. And we think for that reason, we have to be patient with the ways in which gender is playing out in the world. The ways in which we are protecting people is changing the ways in which we are allowing people to associate. And here is the thing. Giuseppe and Corlia talk about how it's an important, I think, tool or a signaling tool for allowing people to see what sort of things individuals have. But gender is something that you actually use in your everyday life to associate with individuals, right? When you choose what sort of housing you're going to have, like in the future, next year, what sort of people you're going to go to the gym with, what sort of friends you're going to keep, you want friends that aren't going to be physically threatening to you, for example, like men often would. You're going to want people, for example, that won't have a criminal record. And we think the comparative here is that once you don't have a world without gender, people have no way of telling that these individuals have the ability to be threatening towards them. Women often want to associate with one another because they with one another, live with one another, go in the same bathroom because they don't feel threatened by other women. They feel threatened by men. And because I have the earlier example and the earlier analysis of how those physical advantages that men have, the intimidation doesn't change, we think it doesn't change under your side when women don't have the ability to signal. In fact, you make it worse because now there's no ability to associate between people and the sort of risk that they bear to us. Last thing I want to talk about is the fact that a lot of people in the courts at the moment can use the historical discrimination that have been pointed against them to their advantage, right? So when women go up and there has been a case of gender-based violence, judges often take it into account that, yeah, historically a lot of women have suffered from sexual abuse, have suffered from gender-based violence. We think it is much more difficult in their world, for example, to say that we had some sort of historical disadvantage or not, because they wipe out that history completely. They wipe out the history of individuals to have or to point back to something at the start. So we think you create safe spaces for people based on the fact that you can use these tools, whether people are physically threatening, whether they have a higher financial position, because financial exclusion is also something that we need to be signaling things about, and we allow people to create safe spaces for themselves. I think last thing I just want to end off with before we hand over to the whip. The government side is a little bit confused what kind of world they want to set. Kate talks about a metaphysical, philosophical world, and Micaella talks about a world in 100 years where things would have been removed through the very systems that they criticize. We think that the remnants and the harms they talk about in those 100 years will still remain. There's no way in which you can completely remove it unless you try our side with incremental change. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to call on the whip of opposing opposition to conclude the debate.
Panel, just because something is a construct doesn't mean it is not real. Just because, gender is a weird thing that the patriarchy, created in order to oppress women, doesn't mean that it doesn't affect the lives of people who aren't women. It doesn't mean it doesn't affect the lives of people who are gendered bodies. It doesn't mean that it doesn't affect queer individuals. What we have to understand, and the only nuance that we get, in this debate, is coming from our bench, where we say that, the socialization of gender is inevitable because of the physicality of people, right? What that necessarily means is that from the two worlds that we're looking at, because Micaella and Kate live in a different world, Kate and Tashin and all of them live in a world where this is metaphysical. What we're saying in that world is like the fact that physical differences are going to continue. And I'll explain that later on. If we talk about Micaella's world, where it's the exact same thing just 100 years down the line, what we're saying is that institutions that continue to accommodate for gender biases are not going to be deconstructed. In both those instances, we'd see gender being the most valuable metric and the most valuable navigator in order to like try to navigate your world, your way in the world as an individual. And so because of that, we think it's really important that you understand the lens from our perspective as an op bench. Firstly, let's just take a step back and understand what gender means, right? So, Kate asked, and like generally people in the debate asked, like, what does it mean for you to be a woman? The great thing about gender in the way that debaters understand it and not the weird Republicans who make laws, which seem to be like the line that opening government was looking at, is that we can't tell you what it means to be a woman, Kate. We can't tell you what it means to be anything, really. The value of gender is that it is non-prescriptive. The value of gender for an individual means that it's fluid. It can be whatever you want it to be. It can be the fact that like I can wear a skirt if I want to. It can be the fact that Maddie Healy at the Daisies can wear like a skirt. But importantly, like gender necessarily becomes like important because of the way that you recognize it for other people. What we're saying in closing opposition is that because like in a world where like, because this was conceded to, strategically this is really important. They agree that sex is going to exist, right? So we're still going to have males, females, intersex people. What we're saying is because that exists, what you do when you remove gender from existing is that you leave people with no mechanisms of recourse. I'm going to deal directly with Blake's stuff here. So here he tells us that like because of economics of care, we don't acknowledge like the value of things. So for example, like people won't have to be pushed into gendered things. Firstly, we tell you when you only recognize sex and not gender, that rather females are still going to be forced into the roles. Women are still going to be biologically bearing children. They're still biologically going to be forced to like do the things because of physicality. Secondly though, because of like very physical things, like we're not going to be able to box, we're not going to be able to like run as fast as men can, and what that means when you don't recognize gender is that you make the playing field even more unequal, right? What it means is that you exacerbate the differences because you don't recognize the fact that you don't have to be the same to be equal. And this is like not a deep thing to understand, right? Like we're debaters, like I was confused by that. But then secondly, he comes up here with just like rhetoric, because he's like, the attribution of gender is unjust. Deep, right? But what does that mean, right? Because firstly, we'd say that empowerment and emancipation comes from your ability to redefine that. It comes from your ability to say that I reject what it means to societally be a woman, and I want to accept what it means to be a woman for me. Importantly, this doesn't mean that this doesn't concede to the fact that like this definition has to happen within the lens of oppression. Why? Actually, why? Firstly, because there were no mechanistic analysis, there was like just no links. Because what we got from Micaella's speech is that like, because your identity is founded in oppression, your identity must be linked to the preservation of the patriarchy. Massive jump at 2. Even if that were true, right? We'd say that that's not what it means to be a woman. What it means to be a woman is what we get in France's speech, right? It's about like culturally and communally, like just being able to say, hey, what's up? And like being able to like identify with someone because of physical things that you never have to explain is the exact same reason and the exact same like value that people get from community spaces. Like safe spaces literally only exist with other people who are like you, right? So like when, for example, right, panel, please understand this, like black people never ever have to explain to other black people why their white friends were problematic. They could just be like, white people, and they would understand, right? It's the fact that you don't have to go through the emotional labor because of a mutual recognition of what it means to be a thing, even if my definition is different to Micaella's definition, is different to Kate's definition. The fact that like the construct of gender is fluid but still established is what's important and what we have to derive value from in today's debate. So even if we're working in the worst case scenario where we are basing like identity founded in oppression, that's still valuable to people. But then thirdly, right, let's look at like closing opposition's world, where like Tashin says that these safe spaces can be formed in sex, right, and not gender. We'd say that in those instances, especially, it becomes incredibly important for you to navigate that space with the mechanism of recourse, because now when you have an act of gender-based violence perpetrated against you, you're going to have that as a female and not as a woman. What that means is that you're never going to be able to firstly access proper mechanisms of recourse and justice, like the court system that Franz said, please give credit to what he said. But then secondly, what that means is that you push non-binary bodies further along into the margins. You render them even more vulnerable than they are, because realistically, a genderless world does not mean a sexless world. Just because the patriarchy have conflated the two doesn't mean we have to. What that necessarily means, though, is that you don't allow for firstly gender expression, but then secondly sexual expression, right? This is stuff that we gave you. So why do we win again? Oh, firstly, because we understand that gender is not prescriptive. It's dynamic, it's fluid, but it's established. The value of the establishment of gender comes from the safety of those who form within those oppressed groups, and because of that, we think we're really, really proud to oppose.